Hi, I'm Isaac Harrison. I'm an Indigenous entrepreneur. I've owned several businesses, currently still own businesses. They include beverages, IT, technology, also include in the past renewables and renewable energy projects, and also do consulting as well, business consulting, coaching, helping other mob social enterprises. Have a podcast called Deadly Discussions. See the rigs at the back. I'm using my headset because I cannot be fussed reconfiguring everything. So today's React video is about black cladding. Now, if you're not Australian, or even if you are Australian, Indigenous people have access to certain contracts in the federal, state governments, even some local councils have a sort of a mandate to engage local Indigenous businesses, or if it's large enough, national Indigenous businesses to come be involved. And usually sits around 3-4%. Well, start at 3. I think they wanted to push it to 4. Can't keep track. I actually haven't won anything in those spaces. So my businesses are consumer facing or business to business, so I don't really qualify. But what it has encouraged is an Indigenous economy that more or less looks like what trade and exchange of information ideas would have happened before colonization. So mob working with other mob, which is great, and building bridges, trying to find ways to include each other into the supply chain, which then the dollar goes further in our communities and lifts up mob together. That's the whole idea of it. So we're going to go on video, which is about black cladding. So this is about businesses that are pretending they're Aboriginal, Indigenous, First Nations, what do you want to use there? I'm Cubby Birragubba man from Queensland, and they're pretending to have Aboriginality or some sort of cultural connection in the ownership of the business, but usually they don't. And in our community, this is something that's spoken about quite often, especially even when there is Indigenous ownership. How far does your supply chain go? Does it go back to the wholesaler? Do they have to be Indigenous for you to qualify? What about the manufacturer? What about the raw minerals from the earth? Do they have to be Indigenous as well? So it's something that's evolving very quickly because this space, Indigenous business space, is rapidly growing. And if you were to, I remember seeing a study from First Nations, First People's Capital. They said about the gap, so to speak, Indigenous people, non-Indigenous people, is a multi-billion-dollar industry. If you actually close it, help Indigenous people with employment business, you actually generate more surplus into the economy. So it's a benefit for everyone. And this topic's pretty hot, and there's a few people that I know in here, which is going to be really exciting. But I'm pretty much independent, podcast independent business owner, and everything I do politically try to stay out of teams, we'll say teams, and just give you a perspective from someone who runs a business with other Indigenous people, serves in that community, whether that's white, black, Asian, whoever, anyone who wants a good experience for our product or service, we're there to provide. So here we go.
NITV wishes to advise that this program may contain images and voices of people who have passed.
First one, so we're not going to skip the intro. Living Black.
Hello and welcome to Living Black. I'm Carla Grant. Today we take a...
All right, let's see straight away. What have we got at the back here? Okay, we've got the Murray Chamber of Commerce up the front at the top. Maybe it's because they've just got a square logo. We got Kinaway Chamber, which I've been a member of. They're the Victorian Aboriginal Chamber of Commerce. We've got the Northern Territory one, which I know some of those guys as well. Lots of trip up there. Their sector, obviously, very resource dependent and tourism. The New South Wales Indigenous Chamber, ACT, Pilbara, Supply Nation, and then National Indigenous Business Chamber. Okay, so off the bat, I'm thinking there's some groups missing. So in Queensland, there's another chamber in Brisbane that's been there for quite a while. Southeast Indigenous Chamber. In WA, there's also the Goldfields Aboriginal Chamber to the south of WA, and I've never been to WA. So there's also, I think, Perth. You've got, I know the Noongar Chamber of Commerce, which is quite an interesting organisation. One where they have the tribal name Noongar. So a lot of these other groups don't have a specific tribal name in the front. Well, Pilbara is a location. It's sort of like statewide. So you're probably already picking up as I'm talking. It is a little bit not disjointed. Now, South Australia does have an organisation that tried to or not to. I'm not sure. I know Matt Karakalakis is on this video, and he is based in SA. And there's like Pat Caruso, another Indigenous fellow that does printing. He's based there, so they would know more than me. But I know that they've tried to, but hasn't worked. Tasmania, I don't think have one. I'm sorry if they do. Groups like Queensland, so there's things called CANS, Indigenous Business Network, Regional Business Network, Townsville. I think they were called Cribben and Tribben. I always remember it because I thought that was like a great name for an 80s hip hop band. And then back on my country, we put together like a little group because, there wasn't really a statewide. So there's a lot of, I want to say movement. I would say more pushing and shoving on who's trying to be the group. There's also a group that not many people know, which was called FASI, which is like a Chambers Alliance that I think was maybe before this National Indigenous one. That was supposed to be all the chambers. So there's always trying to get a peak organization, which is very tough because 300 clans or mobs across the country with their own ambitions and ideas of what they want to accomplish, and then you mix that in with people who aren't on country but live in capital cities like Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, Perth, and they've got other ideas of how to do business as Aboriginal people. And disclaimer, I usually find Indigenous people are usually mixed with Indigenous product or service that's like culturally represented. Like this shirt would be like a cultural item that displays artwork from community, but it's commercial. But then if I were to sell, if I were to sell just phones and I called it Isaac's Telecom, it would be I'm an Indigenous business owner, but I just have a regular Australian business. I could qualify for Indigenous status, but there wouldn't be that much of an advantage because I'm just selling to consumers. So our beer Jarraboy, it has Indigenous elements, but it mainly sells to the wider Australian population and international bodies like markets, tourism. People want an experience from this country. So that's sort of the two distinctions. But anyway, SBS, if you went in blind and you've never worked in the space, I think SBS done all right to sort of slap a few logos. They are missing a few. There's other great in my opinion, because I've worked with them, but other people might say something different, which is like Indigenous Defence Consortium. So that's Adam Goods, and he has heaps of Aboriginal businesses that are trying to break through to the defence sector, and they help break those relationships. So there's a whole list. And then before all of this, so 2015, the Indigenous Procurement Policy came out federally, but before all of this, you have the ORIC, which is like the Register for Indigenous Corporations, which falls under a CATSI Act, which is similar to Corporation Act. And that had hundreds, if not thousands, of organizations that were Indigenous managed and controlled, that were either vying for traditional land ownerships or they were, starting different organizations on profits in their areas. And that's like a whole nother beast. Someone needs to write a thesis on that, and that ain't me, because I'm doing this on a video. So here we go. So 30 seconds in. This is going to be a very long video. Maybe I have to do one or two, but let's see if I can try to get through this and shut up.
Deep dive into black cladding, the process by which white business people put a black face on their enterprises. Often the object is to qualify for federal or state and territory government contracts, which are designed to help black businesses. Indigenous business groups throughout the country have been deeply concerned about black cladding. It's resulted in First Nations people being exploited, robbed, taken to court, and in some cases left with huge tax bills. Tonight, one man's traumatic journey from employee to unpaid director of a so-called Indigenous business.
Melbourne.
Yorta man Colen Briggs never thought he'd be a victim of black cladding. So Colen, what was...
Hey, Briggs. He's a Briggs. Colen Briggs. Probably don't want to mess with the Briggs family. They are pretty large in numbers and they're everywhere and they're involved in many facets of Victorian life in general, whether that's governance, traditional owner, and Yorta is a strong mob. Pastor William Cooper, David Unipin, you don't want to be messing around the Yorta mob. So shout out to Yorta people. Thank you for letting me visit Shepparton. I'm in Bunurong country. I'm down Peninsula. So anyway, continue on.
What was your life like before all of this happened?
Yeah, so before this whole ordeal, my life was really good. I loved life. I'd worked hard to get to where I was. Started my electrical apprenticeship.
It's a deadly outfit though.
Was something that
Ruz knows.
I loved and cherished really, and something I was so grateful for.
So things were going quite well until earlier this year when you went to the mailbox and you found the letter. Tell me what happened.
When I opened it up,
I think going to the mailbox in general and dipping your hand in to see what's in there is always traumatic, let alone what Brother Boy's about to say. But I can see why his face isn't. This not going to be good.
I was just in total shock and just utter disbelief, and just really just so much stress, just encapsulated my whole life. Yeah, so in January of 2024, amongst the letters in the mailbox was one posted to me from the Australian Tax Office. So I opened it and there was a large amount of money owed to the
this year,
office.
24. All the
From
years
the
of blood.
business I used to work for,
2024.
I was liable for those debts because of my role as a director.
What did the letter actually say?
That the business that I had worked for at the time and that I was one of the directors of had accrued debts within superannuation, tax, and GST, and the debts totaled.
All right, so brother here is on this pause. He looks like he still looks nervous. Like you could still in his voice, you could hear the stress from this. It'll be interesting to see because you can't just become a director. Like you can't go from employee to director. It's quite a promotion. He's unpaid director, but usually there's some sort of form that you have to sign. So I don't know if they'll touch on this, if he was like misled or tricked. And that is sort of a highlight to this Indigenous business community is a lot of first generation Aboriginal businesses are potentially walking up to very lucrative contracts if you're in the right space. But there is huge amounts of gray area. And because we don't have, we didn't fast track commercial lawyers, and mob are trying to do that actually, or accountants and CPAs. We don't have advice in our network like people would ask a family or friend for advice. Uncle Tom knows stocks. Auntie such and such is a paralegal. Like there's some sort of connection, second, third degree you can access to with Aboriginal people. Often our first degrees are all in the community and we've got our own issues to deal with. So, okay. So look, I'm not liking where this one's going with Colen here.
Just a little bit under $730,000. So when I saw that, it felt like I was just in a deep dark hole, and one that still to this day I feel like I can't get out of. And there's no more light at the end of the tunnel, really.
Did you feel betrayed by the company owner?
Yeah, definitely. I felt a great sense of betrayal and a great sense of dishonesty from his end. I felt like I'd been taken advantage of because of my age. And I'm 26 years old, and I felt like I was taken advantage of because of my Aboriginality.
We'll come back to Colen's story.
Right, we'll come back. Before we come back there, Carla. So he said young, and he took advantage of my Aboriginality. So probably denoting that the other person who did it is not Indigenous, and they also took advantage. So maybe they got him to form something, sign a form or something that made him a director in the minutes, or something that's happened that he didn't know about. But 700, right? 700. So they're not a small business unless they're just passing it on and they're just like some sort of broker. They're not a small business to be left with that amount. And the young fella talked about he was left with tax, GST, super. So him saying tax instead of like payroll or BAS, more specific, probably shows where he's at as well, being young. And whoever's done this has maybe done a runner. It'd be interesting to see if this business is still around. And I guarantee you, my DMs now will be filled with speculation or who actually did it. But I'm also aware that there's two sides to every coin. So there's something else might have happened, and brother's been left with it. You never know what people's motives are. Man, 700 is so much. Like, there's no amount of GoFundMes that you could do. So I really hope this gets pushed up to the ATO. They're able to investigate this and work out exactly what's gone wrong here. But yeah, not fun. Not fun. Not good on the emotions.
But there are some positives in black business.
Positives. Explanation. I used to have one of those shirts.
First Nations business people gather at a trade fair. It's organised by a big not-for-profit called Supply Nation, led by Kate Russell.
At the moment, we have over 4,600 Indigenous businesses registered, and we support 780 corporate, government and non-profit members and match them with Indigenous businesses to fulfil their procurement needs.
Supply Nation has been supporting the Indigenous business sector's growth for 10 years now. Supply diversity traces its heritage back to the US civil rights movement of the 60s. In Australia, that dream took shape
The King,
from one of the recommendations
Dr. King,
contained in the Open for Business report, handed down by the Rudd government in 2008.
And for the indignity and degradation thus inflicted on a proud people, we say sorry.
The federal government only began giving serious priority to Indigenous businesses 9 years ago. The goal of the Indigenous Procurement Policy, the IPP, is that 3%...
We're going to get more information on Supply Nation because, I'll give you a quick one. Essentially, they run an event each year called Connect, which has hundreds of Aboriginal businesses come, usually Sydney. This year's in Brisbane. And their job is to broker with, so think of like the ASX 250, right? A lot of those companies have some sort of policy that want to engage in social enterprise Indigenous businesses. And so going to Connect and registering a Supply Nation, they essentially streamline their approach into an Indigenous economy that would be a lot harder than you just jumping on Google and finding it. However, on our side, sometimes the requirements of businesses are quite large and complex that our business sector, being young, can actually satisfy that. So what happens is then people, I'm assuming Carla's going to say this, people then start a business with a partnership arrangement or 5149 with an established business to then leapfrog into being high capability to win the work. But then that comes at a cost, which we're about to hear, I assume. So
2% of government contracts and nearly 2% of the total spend should go to businesses owned and controlled by Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders. There's a lot of money at stake when you consider that every year the federal government issues contracts worth about $75 billion, and the states and territories have their own procurement programs.
So let's take federal. 3% of 17 is... You're supposed to answer, not me, because I don't have a calculator. And then states have their own as well. So
The IPP has resulted in over $9 billion of contracts for Indigenous business since it was implemented. So this is a good story. This is one area where the gap is closing. That's 4,600 businesses that are directly benefiting their families and their communities. We are having an intergenerational impact by doing this.
I think it will grow the business sector exponentially. There's about 14,000 Indigenous businesses employing 60,000 Indigenous people.
Katia Hanaway grew up wanting to be an entrepreneur and
So it's a lot of money, it's a lot of turnover. However, my old accountant, an old Jewish man, said, it doesn't matter how much you turn over, it's what you take home and it's where you put it. So I'm older now to know those numbers don't mean anything. You know, if you've got big numbers, big stress, no work-life balance, then you've got to work out, well, is this really worth it? So I'm always cautious when people go, look at these great big stats, because then you're like, maybe, I don't know, bro.
now runs several businesses.
I've actually taught over 50 Indigenous women how to start their businesses, and
I've heard of
incredibly
this fellas,
excited
the Pradillo.
about more and more Indigenous women moving into business, running their own enterprises. I love telling people, you're the director of your own company. It's very empowering, and I've seen people's lives change as a result of that, seeing themselves differently.
Aboriginal businesses are much more likely to hire other Aboriginal
Buddy.
people within the teams operating in that business. Aboriginal businesses will support other Aboriginal businesses. It's not really about the price. It's more about the relationship. And
So I follow Matty, and I've had him on the podcast, and it looks like he's getting interrogated. Sorry, Matty. His element is he like films on the go his podcast, and he's in his own TikTok dances. So it's funny seeing him in like a legacy media clip where he's like, all right, I've got to get my current affair on. This is what's been happening.
by being able to assist another Aboriginal business along that journey.
Late last year, Linda Burney, the Minister for Indigenous Australians, praised the procurement program.
And your support is so important.
But stressed a key problem. Positive outcomes have the potential to be undermined by the practice and perception of black cladding. Unfair arrangements where the economic benefits are not flowing to First Nations people as intended. The government has a zero tolerance of black cladding.
And there's multiple flavours of black cladding. Naomi Anstis, Northern.
So I said they want the successful outcomes to community. So that what is the measure of success? That's the big question, because if it's a job, then for some people that would be a success. If it's a job where you can call your own hours, so you can look after kids or auntie or uncle or mum or dad, that's probably a second tier better outcome. If it's a self-employed opportunity, and then maybe running a business where then you've got a different responsibility but different freedoms, perks, and commitments. So I'm always interested in what they measure by that, because there are a lot of businesses out there that are in that 51-49, and you could say black cladded, some you could say very close to, or some you could say it's an SLA agreement between two parties and that's the structure of the entity. But yeah, it's very interesting because ultimately what's the flow on for community to change their environment around them and change the trajectory for future generations. So a lot of people might be doing a lot of good things and they could be very close to black cladding if they're hitting that outcome. So one, what is the outcome? And then two, say there is black cladding, who's going to enforce it? You know, do we have the commissioner of black cladding? Like who do we send down there, you know? So anyway, going to Kieran. I know Kieran. He's a professor, and we did a US trade mission together. And he's got some wild stories and I think a defense background. So it'd be interesting to hear what he says.
Territory Indigenous Business Network calls out terms like black dooring and blackwashing. They're all flavours of the same thing, where someone's obtaining financial benefit by deception. And rather than calling it black cladding, there's a legal definition for that, and it's fraud. Black cladding's where...
Another one's white anting, like termites, you know. People have pushed so they don't want the word black. Black cladding is a negative connotation associated with our sector. You know, some people I've had, and I'm not talking about a white Australian here saying this, they would say, oh, but you're Aboriginals, you get all the contracts, so it'd be easier to start a business, which is like, kick in the punch in the guts because you're like, well, no, I had to work as a side hustle and build it up until it's self-sustainable, hire the right people, etc. So it's a lot of, on our side, a lot of work to work on the optics to explain to people what this economy, this Indigenous economy actually is.
Kieran Hines is a Warramai man and a professor of cybersecurity. His company helps protect federal government information. He's critical of the current definition of what is an Indigenous business.
There's been numerous cases where non-Indigenous businesses have had an Indigenous owner that's been chopped and changed a number of times. Now, you're a multi-million-dollar business owner
Yes.
that's swapped out on a regular basis. That wouldn't happen in any other circumstances. So is that person really an owner? And it goes back to the definition of owner.
So true.
Matthew Karakalakis has Aboriginal and Greek heritage. He says black cladding is
just on his own website. That's the way, Matty.
I see real serious legal situations come up where the Aboriginal business owner is deprived of profits within the company that goes through to the non-Indigenous shareholders and directors through fictitious loan arrangements.
What is the Supply Nation definition of black cladding?
Personally, I would say black cladding is just a fancy term for fraud, but a more technical definition would be it is when a non-Indigenous party takes advantage of an Indigenous party by accessing opportunities that are specifically meant for an Indigenous business. This could be through an inequitable distribution of profits. It could be through engaging in an activity that is detrimental to that Indigenous business. We know it's a real problem. We know it is a stain on the sector. We've been working to combat black cladding in many ways. But I will say that I do not think it's as widespread as we're led to believe.
Not only is this a chance to showcase our business and our capability and our product, and many mob businesses to do that.
Living Black has spent months talking to Indigenous business people about black cladding. Many say Supply Nation's system of registering and certifying Indigenous...
Wow. I might need a couple of sessions here. So, fraud, like, you can't just go up to anyone and say fraud. Like, if you want to get bloody sued for defamation, you know, that's a pretty big thing. Because there is no enforcing body for existing businesses that are not genuine, I think the registrating parties, so your chambers, your supply nations, have to do greater due diligence on the onboarding process. And I know a lot of them have knocked back even requirements on around certificates of Aboriginality, you know, but that in itself is a whole nother can of worms, because some traditional owner groups won't give certificates to some people because they don't like them. So that's an us issue, a mob issue. So yeah, I think that it's going to have to be greater, but then it's sort of, you can't really tell where, if someone says I'm Indigenous, they could be genetically Indigenous, but not actually culturally Indigenous. So how do you measure that? So it's always going to be tough. So it's hard to throw around fraud. So black cladding, I think, suits the best because it can be strong. And I think there's also a bit of self-regulation within Indigenous business community where we're actually calling it out. And then corporates are doing their own diligence outside of Supply Nation, Kinaway, and government as well. That would be the way forward. 30 minutes. Wow. Okay.
Indigenous businesses is not rigorous enough. One of them is Nungai Warren Mundine, who runs and is a director of a number of businesses. Senator Nigel Scullion famously said that the IPP was a policy game changer for Indigenous people. Has it been successful?
I think it has been successful, but it has its problems. The biggest problem, of course, is black cladding. And black cladding is where, you know, you had non-Indigenous business people and that. To get contracts, what they did was they found an Aboriginal person, they put them up as the chairperson, and they gave them 51% of the shares of the company and that. And they virtually had, you know, gave them money, and they virtually didn't run the place. It was actually run by the non-Indigenous people, and they were getting the benefit from it.
Black cladding was mentioned in the New South Wales Supreme Court last year.
So, Warren, Uncle Warren, the Mundines. Wow. So Warren's been around the space pre-Indigenous procurement policy. Think Labor, then Liberal, and obviously the Voice and things, controversy is there. But what he discussed is, sort of propping up someone to, run the business or whatever. And they actually have no authority. They're just the face. And so what I find with a real Indigenous business, if I have an issue and it's with the, say, 5149 business, I can call the Indigenous person who's in a board position, chairperson or an executive, and have my issue resolved. That's usually the marker of, for me, an Indigenous business, because I know they have the authority to jump on Xero or MyOb or the bank accounts, to sign, to go sit in meetings, to do deals together. So that's the big one for me as well. So again, it's what makes it so hard, because it's part of the pun. It's not black and white. It's not, because who is Indigenous? One, culture or genetics? And if it's genetics, how much you want to do that? The certificate stuff, you go down that DNA side, like that's not going to end well. Two, what is the business? Is it just an Indigenous business owner, or is it a business that offers a cultural intellectual property? Three, what markets are they? Are they in the federal defense, high-end, RDIC, conglomerates having to work together and bid for work as a group? Or so there's a whole different things, and it's really hard. It's sort of horses for courses here. And I think this sector now, 2015, so next year will be 10 years since the IPP. So from Niall Scullion, they just said. So in 10 years, it'd be great to sit back and look and see where the actual value for Aboriginal people has come, because we've seen different versions of how businesses and Indigenous business people can operate. And some have great reputations and some have terrible reputations. Some have one or two really awesome businesses, or have exited businesses and move on to things. One have 15 businesses. You can't run 15 businesses. You are greater than Elon Musk and Steve Jobs and Bill Gates. It's crazy. So that it's going to mature, and we'll be able to have in hindsight. So I think a lot of people fresh out the gate give a bit of grace here. A lot of people fresh out the gate were going into an environment that had never been seen before. So quasi-government, corporate, economy for blackfellas. So let's continue, because I'm not trying to drag this out. It's just, you guys know me.
It involved Indigenous businessman Scott Franks.
As a Wanneroo person, I grew up in the Hunter Valley Basin, born in a little area called Mount Olive, which
he definitely goes for the blues.
In early 2021, Mr. Franks entered into a joint venture with the cleaning company Glad Holdings.
We'll get some names.
Indigenous person.
Here we go.
Mr. Franks had 51% of the shares and was chairman and chief executive. The new company, Glad Indigenous, set out to win contracts for supplying cleaners, traffic controllers and security guards. But in 2023, trust between the two principals began to break down. Glad Holdings took legal action to wind up Glad Indigenous. During a procedural hearing in November 2023, Mr. Franks told the court Glad Indigenous wasn't seeing profits. $130,000 had been withdrawn from the Glad Indigenous bank account by his business partner. Justice Williams noted Mr. Franks' evidence that clients were concerned to ensure that it was genuinely Indigenous owned, managed and controlled, as they did not wish to engage or to be seen to be engaging in black cladding. Glad Holdings failed in its attempts to wind up Glad Indigenous, and Mr. Franks was awarded his legal costs. After the break, how do you qualify to be regarded as an Indigenous business? Tough questions for Supply Nation and what its critics say.
Well, you know what? We should have a break. Color, good idea. I will leave it there. and cut this and drop this. And then with the next couple of days, I'm going to do, looks like there's 3 parts, so 2 and 3, because it is a lot. It is a lot to take on, because it's no small thing. These are livelihoods. And so for some mob, there's some amazing stories. Single mums get involved in Indigenous business that they start and get a lucky break with a contract out on country, change their whole trajectory for their kids. They're able to leave domestic violence, they're able to get out of community, get into a better suburb for their kids to get a better school. So there's some awesome wins. There's also some challenges. And right at the end there with the cleaning one, some advice an accountant gave to me, which was, be cautious of the minority shareholder. And it doesn't matter if you're in as partners or in as 2 companies, JV'd, joint ventured. You'd be amazed at the stress and the damage a minority shareholder. So anyway, that's the first bit of my little review on this corrupting black business, on the Living Black. Is it a channel series? I don't know. Growing up with these shows all around, I don't watch them anymore, but it's funny to see that not much has changed in a way. So I'll leave it there, and I will talk to you all soon.